The summer fairgrounds had been abandoned for decades, but when the Tilt-A-Whirl was finally dismantled in the spring of this year, the crew expected nothing more than corroded bolts and rust-flaked metal. Instead, what they uncovered would fracture a small county's most carefully guarded memory. Beneath the ride's central axis, hidden inside a welded compartment, never mentioned in any fairground schematics, they found objects that should not have been there. Rosary beads strung with rust, a fabric scrap that once carried the weight of religious devotion, and something else, something darker. Initials carved into the inner steel, jagged letters that matched the names of the 7 nuns who had vanished during the county fair of 1988. For years, the disappearance had been treated as a local tragedy, swallowed by rumor and overshadowed by silence. Newspapers at the time suggested the nuns simply left of their own accord, a vague pilgrimage narrative circulated by the convent. The sheriff's department issued a handful of press releases, all thin and non-committal, before the case was quietly shelved. There were no suspects, no memorials, and no closure. For the families of the women, the absence had hardened into a kind of permanent wound, one nobody dared reopen. But now, decades later, this discovery ripped through that silence like a blade through cloth. The county fair itself had once been the heart of community life. The Tilt-A-Whirl, painted in gaudy colors that peeled under sun and rain, was a centerpiece ride, its spinning cars echoing with laughter for generations of children. In 1988, it was already a relic, but it still ran. Nobody at the time noticed anything unusual about its operation. No reports of breakdowns or malfunctions. Yet when the machine was stripped down to its skeletal remains, 36 years later, it was clear that someone had used it for purposes other than amusement. Steel plates had been welded into place deliberately. Beneath the operator's booth, sections of earth were tamped down with unnatural precision, as if concealing or preserving what should have been discarded. The investigative team, called in after the startling find, documented every inch of the ride as though it were a crime scene preserved in amber. Dust was collected, soil samples taken, fibers catalogued. The objects inside the compartment had not been touched since the late 80s, and the stillness of that sealed space carried an oppressive weight. One investigator later described it as stepping into a time capsule of fear, where every artifact seemed to whisper that the official story had always been a lie. What made the discovery even more chilling was how seamlessly it clashed with the accepted narrative. According to the records, the nuns had been seen walking out of the fairgrounds together, last spotted near the livestock barns just after sundown. Several witnesses claimed to have exchanged brief pleasantries with them. The convent announced the following morning that the sisters had left for a retreat. No missing persons investigation lasted more than a week before being reduced to paperwork. Yet here, under the Tilt-A-Whirl, their names were scratched into metal and their belongings buried with care. The contradiction couldn't be ignored. Either the official reports were catastrophically wrong, or they were deliberately falsified. Both options carried terrifying implications. How could multiple accounts place the women outside the fairgrounds when undeniable evidence placed them inside, mere steps from the crowd? Who had access to the Tilt-A-Whirl's inner workings, and what motive would they have to use it as a hidden chamber? Most troubling of all, why had nobody asked these questions before? The cold open of this investigation sets the stage, not just as a story of vanished women, but as a confrontation with institutional silence. This was no mere oversight. The Tilt-A-Whirl was dismantled, only because the land was being cleared for development, and even then, it was chance that the workers noticed the sealed compartment. If not for that stroke of timing, the evidence might have remained buried indefinitely. The people who had lived with this mystery for nearly 4 decades now faced the possibility that the fairgrounds themselves had been complicit, that the laughter and music of the rides had masked something sinister. The camera lingers on the discovered items, the beads, the cloth, the carved initials, each photographed under harsh light. These objects become more than evidence. They are artifacts of broken trust, tokens of women whose disappearance had been explained away with platitudes. For the first time in 36 years, there is tangible proof. that the nuns never walked out of the fair. They were taken, hidden and erased beneath the noise of carnival rides. The sealed chamber beneath the Tilt-A-Whirl is not just a clue. It is a challenge to everything the community believed, a contradiction that demands the silence be shattered. In the summer of 1988, the county fairgrounds pulsed with color, dust and noise. The Ferris wheel spun against a golden sky. The smell of fried dough and kettle corn drifted over the midway, and country bands played on a makeshift stage near the livestock barns. For the rural community, this was the highlight of the year, a week where old grudges were set aside, where children ran free, and where the convent's presence lent a note of calm to the otherwise chaotic carnival atmosphere. 7 nuns from a small order on the edge of town had attended every year without fail. They were quiet, polite, and often volunteered at the livestock exhibitions, blessing animals and speaking softly with families who recognized their faces. That summer, their presence was nothing unusual. No one could have guessed it would be their last public appearance. Witness accounts from the time painted the day as unremarkable. Neighbors remembered seeing the nuns in line for lemonade, their habits standing out amid the plaid shirts and denim shorts. Children laughed at how their veils fluttered in the wind as they stood near the Tilt-A-Whirl, watching it spin. One vendor recalled selling them caramel apples in the late afternoon. There was nothing strange in their demeanor, no urgency, no signs of fear. They moved as a group as they always did, bound by routine and the sense of safety the fair supposedly offered. But as the evening deepened, gaps began to form in the timeline. Fair programs listed a fireworks show scheduled for 9 o'clock, yet not a single credible witness placed the sisters at that event. In fact, after dusk, their presence simply vanished from memory. A few claimed to have seen them heading toward the barns around sundown, but these accounts contradicted one another in detail. Some insisted it was just after the sunset. Others claimed it was closer to nightfall. More troubling, none of these statements matched with the convent's official announcement the next day, which described the nuns as having departed on pilgrimage before the fireworks ever began. For families of the women, the convent's announcement was bewildering. No one had been informed of such a journey. There were no tickets, no luggage, no arrangements made for their responsibilities at the convent itself. Within 24 hours, questions began piling up, yet the sheriff's office treated the matter as administrative rather than criminal. Deputies interviewed fairground staff briefly, filed minimal paperwork, and concluded that the women had left willingly. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the nuns had grown disillusioned with the church. Others whispered about forbidden relationships, or debts, or even secret transfers arranged by the diocese. But in all of these theories, one fact remained buried. 7 women vanished in a public space at a crowded event, and not one reliable witness could trace their steps past sundown. The fairgrounds themselves seemed determined to erase the memory. Rides were dismantled and repainted in the following years, the barns torn down and rebuilt, and the Tilt-A-Whirl maintained as though nothing had ever happened. For the town, it was easier to treat the disappearance as a closed chapter than to confront the discomfort it raised. Yet when viewed in retrospect, the details surrounding that night bristle with unease. The convent story was vague and dismissive. The sheriff's office treated the disappearance as paperwork rather than crisis. And the fair's management quietly avoided questions, never once addressing the strange inconsistencies in scheduling, staffing, or crowd reports. Most striking is the silence of the families themselves. They mourned privately, rarely pressing officials after the initial weeks. Some later admitted they felt pressure from both the church and county leaders to let it be. Public inquiries were deflected with remarks about protecting reputations or not stirring up unnecessary scandal. That enforced silence hardened into the local narrative. The sisters had left, and the town would simply move on. The fair continued each year. The ride spun and children grew up, never realizing that 7 women had once vanished in plain sight among the laughter and lights. Looking back, the summer of '88 now feels like a fragile photograph, sun-bleached, brittle, concealing truths in its faded corners. The images of children on rides, families winning prizes, and nuns smiling for cameras seem almost staged when contrasted with what would follow. What appeared to be the most ordinary county fair became the stage for an event the community chose to forget, even as the evidence of its unresolved horror remained hidden beneath the Tilt-A-Whirl for decades. The fairgrounds at night felt like a place suspended outside of time. Even in the present day, long after the last ticket had been sold and the midway lights extinguished, the land carried the residue of its past. The investigators arrived just as the sun slid beneath the horizon, and the sprawling grounds fell into shadow. Tall grass pushed through cracks in the pavement where once there had been neon lights and painted lines marking queues. The Tilt-A-Whirl stood at the center like a skeleton, its skeletal frame now stripped of panels, its rusted supports groaning whenever the wind shifted. It was no longer a ride, but a monument to something hidden, something deliberately buried. Walking the perimeter, the team noted how sound seemed distorted. Crickets sang in uneven patterns, and the creak of a loosened metal sheet echoed louder than it should have, bouncing through the open space. One investigator paused at the funhouse facade, now collapsed into piles of timber and broken glass. She swore she smelled something faintly sweet beneath the rot, like the ghost of candy apples. Another pointed out how odd it was that sections of the ground near the barns were unnaturally flat, as if packed down by machinery years after the fair closed. It was a detail not mentioned in any property record. The county's official history claimed the land had been left untouched since the final fair in the mid-1990s, but the soil told a different story. Near the center, where concession stalls once lined the pathway, the asphalt bore strange discolorations. Dark ovals spread outward, not quite oil stains, not quite natural wear. Kneeling, the lead investigator scraped a sample into a vial. The texture was tacky despite decades of exposure, suggesting a substance that had seeped up from beneath rather than spilled on the surface. Local children had once whispered that the ground there was cursed, that anything dropped in that section would disappear. At the time, it was dismissed as playground superstition, yet standing in the silence now, it was impossible not to feel that the legend contained a shard of truth. As the team fanned out, they switched on handheld recorders. Their voices sounded small in the emptiness, bouncing back distorted through rusted rides and abandoned booths. In the distance, a chain-link fence rattled, though there was no breeze. One member remarked on the uncanny sensation of being watched, a pressure in the chest as if the fairgrounds themselves remembered what had happened and resented the intrusion. They pressed on regardless, guided by maps of the 1988 layout. Reaching the spot where the Tilt-A-Whirl had recently been dismantled, they found the scar of earth left behind. Large bolts sawn clean protruded from concrete foundations. The compartment that had once been welded beneath was now empty, its artifacts removed and catalogued, yet the air around it felt strangely different, denser, metallic, with a faint chill that clung even as the summer night grew humid. One investigator noted the odd impression of footsteps around the foundation, prints in dust that should have dispersed long ago. The prints led nowhere, evaporating before reaching the perimeter. The sensory detail built an atmosphere of contradiction. The county had claimed the grounds were closed, untouched, abandoned for years, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Tamped soil, sealed spaces, and subtle alterations made long after the fair's decline. Someone had been here. Someone who cared enough to disturb the past while keeping the official record pristine. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances, aware that their presence might not be the first intrusion since 1988. One final anomaly revealed itself as they prepared to leave. At the edge of the livestock barn's ruins, a fragment of painted wood leaned against broken fencing. On it, barely visible under grime, were letters etched in a hurried hand, not all left. The words were small, almost swallowed by rot, but they stood out as a message never meant for public eyes. It was unclear who had written them or when, but their placement, at the boundary of where the nuns were last reported, seen could not be coincidence. The investigators documented the fragment, sealed it, and stood in silence. The fairgrounds at night offered no comfort, only questions, layered beneath the rust and weeds. Whatever happened in 1988 had not dissolved with time. It lingered, etched into steel, soaked into soil, and now whispered from fragments of forgotten wood. The night left them with a sense that the fair had never really closed, It had simply been waiting for someone to notice what lay just beneath the surface. The first tangible archive the investigators turned to was the paper record, the fragile, yellowing pages that had shaped how the story was remembered. In a quiet corner of the county library, a roll of microfilm hummed through the scanner, illuminating headlines that once seemed routine, but now felt strangely curated. The week of the disappearance, local newspapers had splashed bright photos of pie-eating contests and prize-winning hogs across the front page. Buried deep inside, almost as an afterthought, were short columns mentioning that 7 sisters of St. Agatha's convent were embarking on an extended pilgrimage. There were no photographs, no interviews with families, not even confirmation of their departure. The language was deliberately bland, sterile, as though designed to close the subject before it could be opened. The further the investigators scrolled, the more peculiar the omissions became. One edition, dated 2 days after the supposed departure, carried a large feature about the fair's successful attendance. In the corner of a crowd photograph, barely noticeable, the silhouettes of several nuns in habit could be seen near the Tilt-A-Whirl queue. The caption, however, made no mention of them, focusing instead on a local farm boy who had won a ribbon for his calf. The photograph had been chosen, cropped and published after the convent's announcement that the sisters had already left town. The contradiction was subtle but damning. Either the photo was misdated, or the convent's statement was false. More disturbing still were the letters to the editor. In the weeks following the fair, a handful of townspeople had written into question why the nuns had not said goodbye to parishioners or why they had left without notifying families. None of those letters ever appeared in print. Instead, internal library archives revealed typed correspondence from the editor to county officials, discussing community, stability, and the importance of avoiding harmful speculation. What had been presented to the public as silence was, in truth, an editorial choice shaped by pressure from above. Tucked between pages of community announcements, advertisements for farm equipment, and grainy black and white photographs, there were inconsistencies in the timelines. One article mentioned the convent celebrating Mass with all its members present the morning after the fair. Another, published a day later, claimed the nuns had departed the previous night. The contradiction was left unexplained, as though no one noticed or dared to notice. It was this kind of discrepancy that investigators clung to, hard evidence that dates and statements had been deliberately bent out of shape. As the research continued, the investigators discovered a curious pattern in how the story was treated. Each passing week, coverage grew thinner until it vanished completely. By the end of summer 1988, the 7 women were reduced to a single sentence in a seasonal roundup. The Sisters of St. Agatha's have begun their mission abroad. No destination was listed, no photographs of departure published, no follow-up interviews conducted. The story had been erased almost in real time, replaced with fairground victories, crop reports, and county elections. Holding these brittle clippings under the fluorescent lights of the archive room, the investigators felt the weight of manipulation. The press had not simply overlooked the story, they had been steered. The photographs, the missing letters, the contradictions in dates all pointed to an effort to smother public curiosity before it could ignite into scandal. The smiling faces on carnival rides, the blur of fireworks in the grainy images, now carried a sinister undertone. What was once a scrapbook of community pride had become, in retrospect, a camouflage for disappearance. One clipping in particular stood out. It was a small square cut from the classified section, a personal notice that read simply, "Gone where we are told. Gone where no one sees." It had no attribution, no explanation, but was circled in red ink by an anonymous hand, perhaps a librarian or previous researcher. Whether it was a coded message, an inside joke, or something more deliberate, it slipped into the narrative like a ghost note, suggesting that someone knew more than they dared say aloud. By the time the reels of microfilm slowed to a stop, the picture was clear. The newspapers had not told the story of disappearance. They had told the story of erasure, of how a county, with all its power structures intact, had quietly rewritten its own memory. What had been sold as a pilgrimage was, in reality, the first thread in a long chain of concealment. And now, with the Tilt-A-Whirl's discovery breaking through that narrative, the investigators understood they were not only reopening an old case, they were dismantling the very script the town had relied upon to keep its conscience quiet. The man they found was in his late 70s, living alone in a weathered house at the edge of a rural road. His name had appeared only once in the official records of 1988, a line identifying him as one of several deputies assigned to patrol the county fairgrounds. During the week of the event, he had since retired, withdrawn from public life, and rarely spoke of his years in uniform. When the investigators knocked on his door, he hesitated before opening it, as though already aware of why they had come. His eyes, pale and watery, carried the weight of secrets left unspoken for decades. At first his tone was casual, even dismissive. He described the fair as a routine assignment, long hours of crowd control, checking vendor licenses, making sure teenagers didn't drink behind the barns. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as the conversation turned to the disappearance of the 7 nuns, his composure shifted. His hands trembled slightly. His gaze drifted toward the window, and the silence between his sentences grew heavy. "We were told," he finally said, "to keep our heads down, to leave certain questions alone." He explained that on the night of the fair after sundown, he and another deputy had been stationed near the rides. They noticed a cluster of convent sisters moving quickly between stalls, escorted or perhaps shepherded by 2 men who were not in uniform. At the time, he thought little of it. But later, when reports surfaced that the nuns had supposedly departed the grounds entirely, the image haunted him. He filed an incident note about it, a routine entry in his log. But when he returned to check the file days later, the page had vanished. In its place was a neatly typed statement bearing his signature, though he swore he had never signed it, claiming he saw nothing unusual that night. The deputy recalled trying to raise the issue with his superior, but the reaction was swift and chilling. He was summoned to the sheriff's office, where he was told in plain terms that the convent has its reasons, and we respect that. The tone was not merely cautionary, it was threatening. When he pressed further, he received a phone call late that evening warning him to stop making trouble. This voice on the other end was unfamiliar, measured, not a local. He never brought it up again. Over the years, fragments of memory returned in sharper focus. He remembered how one of the fair organizers had closed off access to the Tilt-A-Whirl early that evening, citing mechanical trouble. He remembered walking past the livestock barns after midnight and seeing lights on, though the schedule claimed they had been shut down hours earlier. And he remembered the convent's mother superior arriving at the sheriff's office 2 days later, her visit brief and unrecorded, but followed by a sudden shift in how the case was handled. From that point onward, the message was consistent. There was no disappearance, no investigation, nothing to discuss. When asked why he never spoke up publicly, the retired deputy let out a weary sigh. He admitted that he had considered it many times, but the culture of silence was stronger than his conviction. His colleagues dismissed him, the town avoided him, and eventually he convinced himself that what he saw didn't matter. But the discovery beneath the Tilt-A-Whirl had dredged it all back. "They lied," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They lied, and they expected us to help bury it." Before leaving, the investigators asked if he had kept anything from that time, any notes, mementos, scraps of evidence. After a long pause, he shuffled into the back of his house and returned with a single envelope. Inside was a torn piece of lined paper, the corner of what had once been his incident log. It contained only a few words in his handwriting, scrawled hastily the night of the fair, 7 sisters, escorted, not alone. The rest of the page had been ripped away, but the fragment was proof enough that his memory aligned with something physical, something once real before it was erased. The interview ended with a warning of its own. As the investigators thanked him, he leaned forward and whispered that looking too closely at the fair would stir up forces that had been dormant but never gone. "I survived this long by staying quiet," he said. "You start asking questions, you might not get the same mercy." His words lingered as the team drove away, the image of the broken man etched into their minds. For the first time, they had a voice from inside the machinery of 1988, and it confirmed what they already feared. The official story had been manufactured, and the truth was deliberately smothered before it ever saw daylight. The journal was found almost by accident, tucked inside a battered cardboard box that had been pushed to the far corner of the convent attic. Dust coated its cover so thickly that at first glance it appeared like any other forgotten ledger. The convent itself had long since changed hands. The small order dissolved in the 1990s, its rooms stripped of most personal belongings. But this attic had been left largely untouched, a graveyard of discarded hymnals, broken furniture, and holiday decorations no one had bothered to reclaim. The investigators, combing through the clutter with little expectation, pulled the box down and discovered what looked like a school notebook, wrapped in a yellowing strip of linen. When the cloth fell away, the name Sister Margaret was faintly visible in faded ink across the first page. Inside, the handwriting was steady, small and disciplined, entries written in neat rows across lined paper. At first, the content was ordinary. Prayers copied from scripture, reflections on daily chores, notes about lessons with children in the parish school. The early pages were intimate but unremarkable. Yet, as the investigators turned further, subtle irregularities began to appear in the margins. Words scrawled sideways, half-erased sentences, cryptic notations that broke from the careful tone of the main entries. One margin note, dated a week before the fair, simply read, "Rehearsals, why so late?" Another a few days later, "Music again at night, not from chapel, from beyond fence." These comments were written hurriedly, in darker ink, as though added in secret after the fact. Unlike the main text, they seemed urgent, suspicious, even fearful. By mid-July of 1988, the margins became more crowded. Phrases such as "don't forget," "tickets were not permitted and we are watched" appeared alongside descriptions of the convent's daily routines. It was as though two journals had been layered into one, the official record of a nun's life and a hidden commentary only she understood. One passage stood out above all. On the eve of the fair, Sister Margaret had written a short reflection about service and humility. In the margin, however, she scribbled, "Told not to use them. Tickets false. Why lie?" The line was underlined twice, the only emphasis found in the entire notebook. Investigators froze at the phrase. Tickets to the fair? If the nuns had been instructed not to attend, why were they there at all? And who had the authority to forbid them while ensuring they appeared in public nonetheless? Other entries hinted at a mounting unease within the convent. Several sisters complained of headaches after evening prayers, though the main journal text brushed it off as summer heat. In the margins, however, Sister Margaret noted, "Strange incense again. Not ours." On another page, "Supper missing. We went without." The juxtaposition was chilling, the polished veneer of religious devotion overlaid, with hidden notations of suspicion, deprivation, and control. What unsettled the investigators most was the change in tone as the date of the fair drew closer. The handwriting grew hurried, cramped as though the author feared interruption. She referenced new visitors at night, meetings below, and mother's instructions not to question. On the final entry, before the day of disappearance, she wrote in large, uneven letters along the bottom edge of the page, "We must go, even if it is not our will." Holding the journal in gloved hands, the investigators understood they were reading not just a personal account, but a suppressed testimony. It suggested that the sisters' attendance at the fair was orchestrated, rehearsed, and possibly coerced. The mention of false tickets directly contradicted the convent's later statement that the women had left voluntarily on pilgrimage. These notes reframed the entire case not as an inexplicable vanishing, but as a carefully planned event in which the women had little agency. The journal was photographed, catalogued, and sealed in evidence bags, but the words lingered in the investigators' minds long after they left the attic. The convent had presented itself as a place of faith and order, Yet this single surviving artifact revealed fractures within its walls, secrecy, pressure and perhaps collusion with forces outside. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Who held the late-night rehearsals? What music drifted from beyond the fence? And why would a convent, supposedly a sanctuary, push its members into a public event under such strange conditions? The journal became more than evidence. It was a voice calling across decades, a whispered protest against the silence imposed afterward. Sister Margaret's careful script had endured the collapse of the order, the erasure of records and the decay of the convent itself. Now, 36 years later, her words offered the first true glimpse into what the nuns had known before they disappeared, that they were part of something orchestrated, something staged and something they did not choose. The pushback came quickly, sharper and more coordinated than the investigators anticipated. Within days of the journal's discovery being mentioned in whispers around town, county officials released a carefully worded statement to the local press. It was framed as a reminder to the community, urging residents not to misinterpret artifacts out of historical context. The language was smooth, authoritative, and dripping with the weight of bureaucracy. To casual readers, it sounded like a sensible caution. But to those paying attention, it was a warning. The county was watching, and it did not approve of the direction the inquiry was taking. Behind closed doors, the pressure escalated. Phone calls arrived at the investigator's office, some polite, others less so. One message, delivered with almost clinical precision, suggested that continued digging into the 1988 disappearance could interfere with ongoing legal matters related to property development on the fairgrounds. Another caller was less restrained, muttering that people who stirred up ancient nonsense often found themselves without community support. The implication was clear. Stop pulling at old threads, or consequences would follow. The county commissioners held a brief meeting that week, inviting select members of the press. Their tone was dismissive, describing the renewed interest in the fair as sensational speculation. They emphasized the importance of focusing on the future and praised upcoming redevelopment, projects that would revitalize the land. When asked about the Tilt-A-Whirl discovery, one commissioner waved the question aside, claiming that rusted trinkets did not equate to evidence. Yet the way his hand trembled as he reached for his water glass betrayed a nervousness the cameras failed to hide. The investigators recognized this pattern for what it was, a playbook of institutional suppression. Discredit the evidence, minimize the story, and shift public attention to progress and prosperity. But beneath the polished exterior, the tactics grew more aggressive. The county clerk's office suddenly denied them access to several key files, citing misplaced records and confidentiality. A request for fairground maintenance logs from the late 1980s was returned stamped with the phrase, "Unavailable, destroyed." When the investigators pressed for clarification, they were told the documents had been lost in a basement flood. No insurance claim, however, could be found to back that explanation. One evening after leaving the archive, one of the team members noticed a car following at a cautious distance. Its headlights stayed back but never wavered, shadowing every turn until the investigator pulled suddenly into a crowded gas station. The car idled across the street for several minutes before disappearing into the night. It was a reminder that the county's warnings were not confined to press, statements and polite denials. Someone was watching and someone wanted them to know. The public face of the pushback came in the form of an op-ed published in the local paper. Written under the title Respecting the Past, it condemned outsiders and amateur detectives who were stirring up pain for families who have already found closure. The piece, unsigned but attributed to the editorial board, accused the investigators of exploiting tragedy for attention. What struck the team most, however, was the phrasing. It echoed almost word for word the warning that retired deputy had received decades earlier. Respect the convent's decisions, respect the community, and stop making trouble. The same language, recycled across generations, suggested a continuity of control that had endured long after the fair had closed. Amid this pressure, the investigators faced an impossible choice. They could slow down, avoid confrontation, and risk letting the trail grow cold again. Or they could push forward, knowing they were now working against not just indifference, but active resistance. The journal, the Tilt-A-Whirl, the deputy's testimony, each discovery had cracked the county's official story wider. And with each crack, the pressure to stop grew more intense. The tension was no longer abstract. The fairgrounds were no longer just a place of mystery, but a battlefield of narratives. The official version, smooth and dismissive, and the emerging truth, jagged and dangerous. The investigators understood that the more they uncovered, the more the county would tighten its grip. The silence that had smothered 1988 was not just cultural, it was enforced. And now, with 36 years of control unraveling, the county was showing its teeth. The cassette surfaced from an unlikely place, a cardboard box donated to a church rummage sale. It was buried beneath old hymnals, a chipped ceramic Virgin Mary, and stacks of outdated choir sheet music. A volunteer sorting through the items noticed the tape because it lacked a label, just a blank, scuffed plastic case with no markings. The parish nearly discarded it with the junk pile. But curiosity led someone to slide it across to the investigators who had been quietly asking questions about convent belongings. The timing was uncanny, almost too convenient. But the moment they held the cassette in their hands, they felt the weight of something that had survived deliberately, like a message meant to outlast silence. The tape was warped from decades of neglect, its spools tangled and brittle. The investigators had to use a specialist to restore it, carefully rethreading the magnetic ribbon into a refurbished deck. When they pressed play, the first sounds were nothing remarkable. White noise, static, the mechanical hum of recording. But gradually, faint audio began to bleed through. The unmistakable murmur of a crowd, laughter, the rise and fall of carnival music. The melody was tinny, distant, and immediately identifiable. The carousel's organ tune, a song still etched in the memories of anyone who had attended the county fair in the 1980s. For several minutes, the recording seemed like nothing more than background ambience, perhaps a tape made by a convent sister, capturing the joy of the fair. But then, layered beneath the carousel music, voices emerged. At first they were indistinct, shards of words lost in noise, as the restoration software cleaned the file. However, certain phrases became hauntingly clear. A woman's voice, urgent and strained, called a name, "Agnes!" Another followed, "Sister, wait." These were not the sounds of playful banter or casual chatter. They were sharp, panicked, recorded. Against a backdrop of laughter and music that made the cries all the more chilling. The timestamp on the tape was critical. The analog counter suggested it was recorded just past 9 p.m., the very time when official reports claimed the sisters had already departed for their so-called pilgrimage. Yet here they were, still on the fairgrounds, their voices captured amid the crowd. One segment even caught the muffled sound of something metallic slamming, followed by a brief silence, and then the carousel tune resuming as if nothing had happened. To anyone else in the fairground that night, the noise would have been swallowed by the chaos of carnival rides. But on tape, preserved in isolation, it sounded like a door closing or being locked. As the investigators listened, they could hear additional fragments. A man's voice, low and curt, barked something indecipherable in the background. The nuns' cries grew fainter, suggesting distance, as if they were being led or pulled away. Then suddenly, the recording cut to static. The remaining 30 minutes of the cassette was nothing but white hiss, as if the tape had been recorded over or deliberately erased. The implications were staggering. This was not just anecdotal memory or second-hand rumor. It was an artifact capturing evidence in real time. It placed the sisters at the fair hours after the convent's statement claimed they were gone. It revealed distress, urgency, and the presence of figures who were not accounted for in any official narrative. Most damning of all, it suggested that their removal had been masked by the very atmosphere of celebration, the music and laughter providing perfect camouflage for abduction. The team documented the tape meticulously, photographing the cassette, logging the sound restoration, and archiving digital copies. Yet they also understood the danger of what they now possessed. The county had already issued veiled threats, and the discovery of this tape, if made public, would dismantle the foundation of the official story. Whoever had gone to such lengths to silence the truth in 1988 would not allow this recording to circulate without resistance. Late that night, one investigator played the tape again in the solitude of his office. He closed his eyes and listened to the carnival sounds, letting the voices wash over him. What struck him most was not the panic, but the humanity. In those cries, the raw fear of women, caught in a moment they did not choose. The recording was short, fragmented, imperfect, but it was enough to puncture the county's manufactured silence. For 36 years, the nuns had been absent only in body. Their voices had survived, sealed in a warped cassette, waiting for someone to finally hear them. The funhouse stood at the far edge of the fairgrounds, a sagging structure left to rot after the fair's decline in the early 2000s. Most of the rides had been dismantled and hauled away. But the funhouse tunnel, half brick, half corrugated steel, was deemed too costly to tear down. Over time, storms had warped its frame, the paint had peeled, and creeping vines coiled around the entrance like a slow reclamation. From the outside it looked harmless, even quaint, a relic of carnival days past. But for the investigators, it had become a point of fixation. Several accounts from 1988 mentioned the ride closing early on the night the sisters vanished. Maintenance logs, what little survived, noted repairs required but gave no specifics. And in the cassette tape, the metallic slam that echoed, before the static matched the resonance, of a door within this very structure. Stepping inside was like entering a tomb. The air smelled of mildew and wet plaster, thick with the scent of abandonment. Water dripped in rhythmic intervals, echoing through the hollow tunnel. Rusted light fixtures dangled uselessly, their wires chewed by time. The investigators carried portable lamps, beams slicing through the darkness to reveal remnants of carnival illusion. Distorted mirrors cracked down the center, faded murals of clowns grinning with chipped teeth, plywood walls warped and splitting. Each corner seemed to whisper the laughter of children long gone. But beneath that was something heavier, like an aftertaste of dread. They moved slowly, documenting every corridor. What struck them first was how certain sections of the funhouse didn't match the original blueprints, retrieved from the county's archives. A narrow hallway, for example, extended deeper than plans suggested. Behind one false wall, they found an uneven seam where boards had been nailed hastily, then painted over to mimic the striped carnival motif. The seam had since warped, exposing gaps that revealed another chamber beyond. It took effort to pry the boards away, but when they did, the investigators entered a hidden crawl space, one never listed in the ride's original design. Inside, the ground was layered with soil and debris, clearly disturbed at some point. Shards of broken glass and a rusted length of chain lay half buried in the dirt. At the far end, beneath the sagging beams, they discovered a collapsed trapdoor. Its hinges were bent, as though forced shut under pressure. They cleared the soil away carefully and saw the faint outline of initials scratched into the wood. The letters were crude but unmistakable. S.A. The investigators immediately thought of Sister Agnes, the name called out on the cassette tape. The soil beneath the trapdoor carried marks of disturbance, compressed earth that suggested weight, possibly storage, but more chilling were the stains that had seeped into the boards above. Faded, nearly invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable under the ultraviolet lamp. Dark streaks that fluoresced faintly, remnants of something spilled long ago. The investigators said nothing for several moments, the silence punctuated only by dripping water. It was not definitive proof of violence, but it was a physical echo, a scar left in wood that no official report had ever acknowledged. Further inside the crawl space, they found remnants of cloth preserved in the damp earth. Small frayed scraps, one of which carried the faint trace of blue embroidery. The stitching was delicate, the kind used in convent habits. They collected each fragment with sterile gloves, sealing them in evidence bags. Alongside the cloth lay a broken rosary, its chain snapped, beads scattered in the dirt like discarded prayers. The deeper they went, the more the structure resisted. Rotting beams threatened collapse, forcing them to retreat before the floor gave way. But even in withdrawal, the investigators carried with them artifacts that told a story hidden beneath the carnival's facade. This funhouse, sold to children as a chamber of mirrors and tricks, had concealed something darker, a chamber of control. Confinement, perhaps even silence. When they emerged back into daylight, the investigators marked the funhouse on their maps with heavy red ink. It was not just a ride. It was a nexus, a place where blueprints had been altered, logs falsified and lives erased. They stood at the edge of the structure, listening to the distant hum of cicadas, and realized they were trespassing on ground that had been deliberately left to decay. It was not abandoned by accident. It had been allowed to rot, so the secrets within would rot alongside it. The discovery reframed everything. The nuns hadn't simply vanished into thin air. They had been funneled, perhaps literally, into a hidden space built beneath laughter and illusion. And if this was true, then the fair itself had been more than just a celebration. It had been a stage, a cover, an engine designed to mask something far more sinister. The first article broke on a Wednesday morning, tucked halfway down the front page of the Hillsdale Chronicle. It wasn't sensational, not at first glance, just a headline about renewed questions surrounding the 1988 disappearance of 7 convent sisters. But inside, buried between cautious language and the editor's restraint, the words carried dynamite. The piece mentioned the cassette tape, though not in detail, and alluded to anomalies in the funhouse structure recently, examined by independent investigators. What caught the public's eye wasn't the evidence itself, but the timing. 36 years of silence broken by tangible discoveries, juxtaposed against the county's insistence that nothing had ever been amiss. Within hours, the phone lines at the newspaper lit up. Some callers thanked the reporters for daring to publish what so many had whispered about. Others, more hostile, accused them of defiling sacred ground and harassing the memory of the dead. The town fractured. Along predictable lines, older residents leaned toward silence. Younger ones demanded answers. Social media, small but loud in this rural community, amplified the split. Posts shared grainy photos of the fairgrounds, rumors about missing records, and half-remembered stories from childhood about the sisters who walked in and never walked out. The county's reaction was swift and defensive. A press conference was hastily arranged, staged in the marble lobby of the courthouse. 3 officials stood at the podium: the county commissioner, the sheriff, and a spokesperson for the local diocese. Their message was unified, polished, and unmistakably rehearsed. They condemned the article as reckless conjecture and insisted that no physical evidence exists to support these rumors. They invoked the dignity of the church, the reputation of the community, and the good name of hard-working county employees unfairly slandered. Every sentence was calculated to steer the story away from evidence and back into the fog of rumor. But the press conference backfired. A young reporter, emboldened by the Chronicle's coverage, asked a pointed question. If the sisters had left the fair on pilgrimage, as the official record maintained, then where were the travel documents? No bus tickets, no hotel receipts, no convent logs showing their arrival at any destination had ever been produced. The officials froze, their eyes darting toward each other. The sheriff gave a tight smile, muttered something about records lost in transition, and moved on. But the hesitation had been captured on every camera in the room. By evening, the clip circulated widely, reframed as a glaring contradiction in the official story. As pressure mounted, community meetings grew tense. At a town hall, one elderly woman stood trembling at the microphone, clutching a faded fare ticket from 1988. She claimed she saw the sisters being led toward the rides after dark, though she had never spoken up, because no one wanted to listen back. Then, her words sparked both applause and heckling from the crowd. Another man shouted that outsiders were digging graves that were better left closed. Arguments erupted in the aisles, neighbors turning against neighbors, the air thick with decades of suppressed unease. For the investigators, the sudden spotlight was both blessing and curse. On one hand, the case was no longer confined to whispers and hidden files. It had broken into the open, forcing officials to engage. On the other hand, visibility brought danger. Their names appeared in print, their photos circulated online, and strangers began calling their homes. One investigator returned to find her, mailbox pried open and its contents strewn across the lawn. Another discovered a note slipped under his windshield wiper. "Stop or you'll regret it." The threat was not subtle, yet the investigators pressed forward, bolstered by the knowledge that secrecy had finally cracked. They submitted their findings: photos of the crawlspace, scans of the cassette, copies of the altered blueprints, to a regional news outlet with broader reach. The outlet agreed to run a feature, but demanded corroboration, proof stronger than stained wood and faint voices on tape, something undeniable. That demand turned the team's focus back to the artifacts themselves. The cassette tape, warped and fragile, was already undergoing forensic sound analysis. The cloth scraps from the funhouse were being examined for textile dating. But what they needed was a piece that connected unmistakably to the sisters, something personal, irrefutable, and traceable to the night they vanished. Meanwhile, the public sphere continued to ripple with unease. Churches included pointed sermons about false prophets sowing discord. Flyers appeared in shop windows urging residents to protect Hillsdale's honor. Local radio host ranted for an entire hour about how the town was under attack from conspiracy theorists. But beneath the noise, a current of doubt grew stronger. People who had long avoided discussing the fair began to wonder aloud. Had they been lied to for nearly 4 decades? The battle lines were drawn not only in courts or archives, but in the hearts of ordinary residents, each forced to choose between silence and suspicion. For the first time, the fairgrounds were no longer just ruins. They had become the fault line of a community grappling with its own shadow. And with each passing day, the weight of truth pressed harder against the crumbling dam of the official story. The convent was a place the investigators had hesitated to approach directly. For decades, its walls had seemed untouchable, guarded not just by stone and habit, but by the aura of sanctity that discouraged questions. Yet the case was circling back inexorably to that very threshold. The missing sisters had belonged to this order. The diocese had been one of the loudest voices urging silence, and whispers from townspeople suggested that the convent itself held chambers no one outside had ever seen. When an aging groundskeeper, long since retired, agreed to speak quietly with the team, the final barrier began to crack. The man's memory was failing, but certain details had stayed sharp. He recalled that in the months after the disappearance, he was ordered to assist in repairs to the convent basement after a heavy storm. While hauling supplies down the stone steps, he noticed a section of flooring that sounded hollow when struck. When he asked about it, the Mother Superior at the time told him simply, "That's not your concern," he obeyed. But the sound of that hollow floor had haunted him. Now, 36 years later, he pointed the investigators to the spot. Armed with ground-penetrating radar and reluctant permission from the current leadership, who framed the EAE investigation as an intrusion we nonetheless tolerate, the team descended into the basement. The chamber smelled of damp stone and candle wax, with narrow shelves of aging preserves and religious relics stacked neatly against the walls. The radar quickly confirmed the groundskeeper's memory. Beneath the flagstone floor lay a cavity, rectangular in shape, perhaps no larger than a walk-in closet. It should not have existed. Removing the stones was painstaking. Dust and grit coated their gloves as they pried up the slabs, revealing a sealed wooden hatch beneath. The hinges were rusted but intact, and a tarnished iron lock had once kept it fastened. It had been broken decades ago. The clasp bent violently as though forced open. When the team lifted the hatch, stale air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable odor of mildew and something metallic, like rust or old blood. Inside, the cavity was lined with shelving. What they found there was not skeletal remains, as some had feared, but an archive. Boxes wrapped in cloth, metal tins, stacks of papers tied with brittle twine, and atop them all a leather satchel bearing a convent insignia. Inside the satchel were items too specific, too personal to ignore. Rosaries with initials etched faintly into their crucifixes, handwritten prayer cards with names that matched the 7 missing sisters, and a folded letter dated July 1988. The Letters' edges were water-stained. But its words remained legible. They are not safe here. The fair is only the beginning. Further inspection revealed journals, not unlike the one recovered earlier, but these had been deliberately hidden. Margins carried frantic notes, written in different hands. Do not follow them. Doors beneath the rides. We are told not to speak. One entry, dated the very night of the fair, mentioned a directive from the Mother Superior herself, an order for the sisters to attend the fair despite protests from several within the convent. No explanation was given, only the cryptic phrase, "Our obedience is their protection." The most chilling discovery was a small reel-to-reel tape, stored in a tin-marked choir practice. When tested, it revealed not hymns, but a recording of what sounded like a hurried meeting. Male voices unfamiliar, discussed logistics in curt tones. 7 confirmed. Transport. After dark. Close. The rides before curfew. 8. Woman's voice interjected once, stern and clipped, but her words were drowned in the overlapping conversation. The recording cut abruptly after 42 seconds, leaving behind only the hiss of dead air. This was no longer just circumstantial. The vault beneath the convent tied the order itself directly to the night of the disappearance. The artifacts, rosaries, journals, recordings were undeniable. Tangible proof that the nuns had not vanished into myth, but had been tracked, managed, and possibly sacrificed, in some manner that the convent and county alike had worked to bury. The investigators emerged from the basement shaken, their evidence bags heavy with objects that demanded explanation, yet even in triumph unease lingered. Someone had chosen to preserve these items rather than destroy them, hiding them beneath stone and prayer. Whether it was an act of conscience or control was unclear, but what was certain was this. The convent had never been a passive witness to the disappearances. It had been a participant, its sanctity shielding secrets buried just beneath its own floors. When news of the vault inevitably leaked, the community's fracture deepened into open rupture. Parishioners demanded accountability, while officials scrambled to frame the discovery as misfiled archives. But the images of rosaries, journals, and reels hidden beneath stone circulated faster than explanations. The convent's silence, once a bulwark, was beginning to crack under the weight of artifacts it could no longer deny. The excavation began under cover of night. It had to. By now the fairgrounds had become a magnet for curiosity seekers, journalists and protesters. Daytime work would have meant interruptions, arguments, and the hovering presence of county officials eager to shut it all down. So the investigators, joined by a handful of trusted allies, assembled under portable floodlights by the Tilt-A-Whirl. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of cut grass and rusting steel. The ride itself loomed like a skeleton, its skeletal frame creaking faintly in the wind. Beneath it lay the pit, partially collapsed during years of neglect, its soil unstable and veined with old concrete footings. This was where the carnival laughter had masked something else, and now they meant to find it. Heavy equipment had been arranged quietly through sympathetic contractors. The first strike of the backhoe claw against earth rang out with a metallic clatter that reverberated across the grounds. The soil, long compacted by decades of weight and weather, resisted at first, but layer by layer it gave way. Investigators watched anxiously, their shadows long against the floodlight glow. Every shovelful of dirt removed felt like peeling away another layer of silence. Barely 2 feet down, the first anomaly appeared, a slab of poured concrete, irregularly shaped, not part of any known foundation. Its surface bore stamped impressions, numbers and letters arranged in sequence, though partially eroded. One investigator brushed dirt away with gloved hands, whispering the fragments as they emerged. 0788, Lot B. The date stamped into concrete was July 1988, the very month of the disappearance. No official plans listed any such slab. It was proof of construction that had been concealed and deliberately undocumented. Jackhammers shattered the surface, and beneath the concrete was not soil but a cavity, hollow and echoing. When a floodlight was lowered into the gap, the beam revealed a chamber, walls lined with timber, the skeletal framework of a room sealed beneath the ride. Dust motes swirled in the artificial light, and faint graffiti could be seen scrawled on the boards, marks that looked like names, partial and desperate. One set of letters, shakily etched, seemed to form Anne. Another, barely legible, looked like the beginning of Mary. The chamber was accessible only by widening the break in the concrete. Workers pulled boards loose, the wood splintering with age, until an opening was large enough to crawl through. The investigators descended, hearts pounding with anticipation and dread. The air was suffocating, stale, metallic, mixed with the unmistakable smell of decay, though no bodies remained. Instead, the space was littered with remnants: a tattered shoe, the strap of a leather satchel, broken glass from a jar that once held something now long evaporated. But it was the walls that told the real story. Along the planks were faint handprints pressed into dust and dirt, as though people had tried to steady themselves or signal their presence. In one corner lay a small pile of rosary beads, gathered deliberately as though in prayer, and scratched deep into one of the beams were words that made the investigators' blood run cold. "They said we must." Phrase echoed the cryptic notes found in the convent journals, reinforcing the chilling suspicion that obedience, forced or manipulated, had delivered the sisters into this hidden chamber. As the team documented every inch, a new discovery shifted the night from quiet excavation to full spectacle. Buried beneath a loose board was a small metal box, sealed tight, its lock rusted but still intact. Forcing it open revealed a stack of photographs, Polaroids. Their colors faded, but their images disturbingly clear. They depicted the county fair of 1988, the Tilt-A-Whirl spinning, children holding cotton candy, crowds milling about. But in the margins of several shots, blurred but unmistakable, were the sisters. They were not laughing or walking freely. They were grouped together, flanked by two men whose faces were turned from the camera. One photo captured the fear plain on a nun's face as she glanced sideways, her mouth caught mid-cry. The photographs were damning. Unlike journals or tapes that could be dismissed as misinterpretations, these images were physical, visual, undeniable. They placed the sisters at the fair at the exact time they were claimed to have already left, and they captured them under duress. Someone had taken these pictures, preserved them, and buried them in the chamber as if to safeguard the truth while simultaneously concealing it. Above ground, the excavation had not gone unnoticed. Cars began to line the roadside, drawn by the floodlights and the thrum of machinery. By midnight, a crowd had gathered, pressing against the temporary fencing, murmuring, shouting questions, some praying aloud. Word spread fast through phone calls and social media. Something was being unearthed at the fairgrounds. By dawn, journalists with cameras were recording the scene, their lenses capturing investigators pulling artifacts from the earth. The set piece was no longer confined to the shadows. It had spilled into the public sphere, undeniable and irreversible. The county could no longer smother the story in editorials or press conferences. The chamber, the Polaroids, the artifacts, all of it was in plain sight, broadcast in real time. What had been rumor for 36 years now stood as proof, pulled from beneath the Tilt-A-Whirl like bones rising from a grave. The investigators, exhausted and shaken, stood at the lip of the excavation pit as dawn painted the sky gray. They understood that the case had shifted irrevocably. Whatever had been hidden was now visible to all, and the consequences would not just ripple through Hillsdale, but spread far beyond. And yet, amid the triumph of exposure, a gnawing unease persisted. If this was what lay beneath one ride, how much more remained buried, waiting for light? The hearings were inevitable. Once the photographs from the Tilt-A-Whirl chamber made their way onto television, screens and news websites, pressure on the county board reached a breaking point. For decades they had deflected, denied, and dismissed the disappearance as either myth or misunderstanding. But the images of the sisters, flanked by faceless men, images now dissected frame by frame on nightly broadcasts, were impossible to explain away. Within a week, the courthouse auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled the first 3 rows, cameras mounted on tripods like rifles, aimed at the panel of officials seated stiffly on the dais. Behind them hung the county seal, suddenly a backdrop for suspicion rather than authority. The air was electric with tension. Families of the missing sisters, some grey-haired now and leaning on canes, sat alongside angry townspeople demanding accountability. The investigators occupied a narrow table to one side, their evidence folders stacked in neat piles, photographs enlarged onto poster boards beside them. Each artifact, the Polaroids, the journals, the cassette, waited to be entered into the record. The spectacle had shifted from excavation site to courtroom theatre, and the stakes were no longer academic. The first official to speak was the county commissioner, voice calm but trembling at the edges. He described the discoveries as deeply troubling but cautioned against leaping to conclusions that dishonor both the living and the dead. He insisted that while the artifacts merited investigation, they did not prove criminal wrongdoing by the county or the convent. "We must remember," he said, "that objects can be misinterpreted." His words fell flat. The room bristled, and a murmur of disbelief swept through the audience. Next came the sheriff, more defensive, his jaw tight. He admitted that records from 1988 were incomplete, but denied any deliberate cover-up. When pressed about the vanished incident, logs and the destroyed maintenance records, he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Paperwork was different back then," he muttered. "Not everything was digitized. Things get lost, but when an investigator produced the stamped concrete fragment marked 788 Lot B and laid it before him, the sheriff's expression faltered. It was a physical impossibility. Proof that construction had been deliberately concealed, and no explanation could erase the numbers carved in stone. As testimony continued, contradictions piled up. Former employees of the fair stepped forward with memories they had never dared voice. Rides closed without explanation. County trucks arriving late at night. Orders given that didn't make sense. A woman recalled being turned away from the funhouse by men who weren't in uniform. A retired EMT described being stationed nearby yet never dispatched to what he later realized was a night of crisis. Each story chipped away at the official narrative until it resembled nothing more than scaffolding around an empty shell. The most explosive moment came when one of the investigators played the cassette tape for the room. The carousel music, the cries of Agnes, the metallic slam, all of it filled the chamber. The sound was faint but undeniable, cutting through the years with eerie clarity. Several in the audience gasped aloud. One of the elderly relatives covered her mouth and began to weep. The sheriff shifted again in his seat, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. By the end of the first day, the hearings had accomplished what decades of rumor could not. They cracked the county's authority in public. No statement, no polished press release could undo what people had seen and heard with their own eyes and ears. The story was no longer a fringe curiosity. It was a scandal unfolding live, broadcast, and recorded for anyone to dissect. But exposure came at a cost. Outside the courthouse, demonstrators clashed, some demanding justice, others insisting the investigators were liars, destroying the community's reputation. Homemade signs read "Truth for the Sisters," while others shouted "Protect our town." Police cordoned off the steps, but the shouting carried into the night. The division was no longer quiet, it was loud, angry, and irreversible. The investigators, exhausted, left the courthouse under escort. They carried with them the knowledge that while the hearings had validated their work, they had also painted targets on their backs. Power had been embarrassed in front of the public, and power rarely forgave humiliation. As they drove away from the courthouse, the town's church bells tolled the hour. For some it was the sound of reckoning. For others, it was a warning that the fight was only just beginning. The truth had been forced into daylight, but daylight, they knew, could be just as dangerous as the dark. The convent sat on the edge of town, its stone facade weathered by decades of storms, its windows casting a dim glow into the evening air. For years it had been a silent backdrop to the mystery, a place of half-answers, guarded statements, and carefully managed silence. But after the public spectacle of the hearings, the investigators knew they could no longer circle the question. If the missing sisters' story was ever to be resolved, it had to pass through these walls. They arrived at dusk, carrying with them copies of the photographs, the cassette tape, and fragments of the journals. The heavy oak doors groaned open. revealing a corridor that smelled faintly of wax and damp stone. A nun in her 70s, face pale but composed, greeted them with a nod and led them into a meeting chamber. There, seated at a long wooden table, were 3 members of the convent's leadership. Their habits were immaculate, their hands folded neatly, but their eyes carried a weight that betrayed years of rehearsed restraint. The lead investigator placed the photographs on the table one by one. The images, though faded, were sharp enough to capture every uncomfortable detail. The sisters at the fair clustered together, the fear etched into their faces. The silence in the room deepened. One of the women drew a slow breath, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Finally, the Mother Superior, A.E., stern figure with a presence that commanded the room, spoke in a voice low and deliberate. "You must understand," she began. "There are truths that were never ours to speak." Her words were careful, shaped like stones laid across a river. What happened in 1988 was not random. It was not a disappearance without cause. It was a decision imposed upon us. The investigators pressed her, pointing to the journals and the scratched words on the chamber wall. They said we must. Who were they? Who had the authority to compel 7 women of faith into silence and concealment beneath a carnival ride? The Mother Superior's hands tightened over the edge of the table. "The county demanded obedience," she said finally. "They came with contracts, with threats. They told us that certain things would ensure the convent's survival, funding, protection, the continuation of our mission. The sisters were told to participate. They were told it was necessary." "But necessary for what?" the investigator asked, the frustration breaking through. "Why seal them under the fairgrounds? Why leave them there?" The answer came haltingly, not as a confession but as a wound reopening. According to the Mother Superior, the sisters were taken under the guise of a ceremony, one that combined county officials, fair organizers, and unnamed benefactors who had invested in the fair as more than entertainment. It was an offering, she admitted, though the meaning of that word remained vague, wrapped in both spiritual language and bureaucratic euphemism. Whether it was ritual, corruption, or a grotesque combination of both, she would not or could not say. The younger nun at her side finally broke down. Tears streaked her cheeks as she whispered that she had been a novice then, too young to understand fully, but she remembered hearing muffled cries carried across the convent courtyard that night. "We were told never to ask again," she sobbed. "And we didn't. For all these years we didn't." The investigators pressed for specifics, names, signatures, documents. That was when the Mother Superior gestured toward the convent archives, her vaulted room beneath the chapel. "You will not find everything," she warned, "but you will find enough." Her voice trembled as she admitted that certain records had been removed long ago, taken by county officials during visits that were never questioned. But fragments remained, receipts stamped with dates that didn't align, letters coded with vague instructions, ledgers showing money that flowed inexplicably from the fair into the convent's accounts. Descending into the archives, the investigators found exactly that, a paper trail faint but damning. A file folder contained correspondence between the convent and the county treasurer, using careful euphemisms like support for the arrangement and ensuring discretion. Another folder held handwritten notes from a sister no longer alive, detailing her unease with what was happening. In one chilling entry she wrote, "We are asked to be silent, to be shadows, but shadows are made by light." When the investigators resurfaced, their arms full of files, the convent chamber was quiet again. The Mother Superior sat in silence, her eyes fixed on a crucifix on the wall. "What you do with this," she said finally, "will bring judgment not only on us, but on this town. Some truths do not heal when exposed. They fracture." The words hung in the air as the investigators left, stepping into the cool night. Behind them, the convent loomed, its windows glowing faintly against the dark sky. For decades, it had stood as a place of sanctuary. Now it was revealed as something else, a witness, and perhaps a participant, in a pact that had stolen 7 lives. The confrontation had given them answers, but it had also deepened the shadows. The sisters had not simply vanished. They had been delivered. And though the convent had spoken at last, the weight of what they withheld still pressed heavy on the air. The investigators knew the fight was no longer just about finding truth. It was about what the world would do with it once it was finally undeniable. The story did not stay local. By the end of the week, Hillsdale was no longer just a dot on the state map. It was a headline carried coast to coast. Major outlets dispatched crews to the fairgrounds, setting up satellite trucks in the fields where cotton candy booths once stood. National anchors broadcast live from the Tilt-A-Whirl pit, their polished voices describing what locals already knew but the rest of the country, now consumed with horrified fascination. 7 nuns had disappeared in 1988, and 36 years later, evidence suggested they were silenced by a combination of county power, church complicity, and something darker still. The photographs circulated online, dissected in comment sections, podcasts, and late-night news panels. Freeze frames of the sisters' frightened faces became icons of victimhood, appearing on magazine covers with headlines like The Carnival, Pact and Faith Betrayed, Talk. Radio shows buzzed with speculation about ritual, corruption, and whether the town had been complicit by turning away from uncomfortable questions. For every voice demanding justice, there were others accusing the investigators of sensationalism, of exploiting grief for notoriety. The controversy only made the story bigger. Inside Hillsdale, the effects were immediate and brutal. Businesses along Main Street reported losing customers as outsiders arrived. To gawk, and locals avoided the downtown entirely. The County Fair Committee announced it would suspend operations indefinitely. A statement met with cheers from some and fury from others who depended on the fair for their livelihoods. Churches split along lines of denial and reckoning. Some priests preached about healing and forgiveness. Others insisted the investigators were tools of the devil, sowing division with lies. Congregations fractured. Families stopped speaking to one another. The investigators themselves became reluctant public figures. Their names were printed in national articles, their faces broadcast on evening news. Strangers sent them letters of gratitude and letters of threat in equal measure. One morning, a man in a pickup truck slowed outside their temporary office and shouted obscenities, accusing them of destroying God's house. Hours later, a widow quietly delivered them a shoebox of old fare tickets and receipts she had saved, whispering that her late husband knew too much but never dared say it. Meanwhile, the political fallout spread. State officials announced a formal inquiry into the county's handling of records, hinting at criminal charges if negligence or conspiracy could be proved. The county board scrambled to protect itself, issuing defensive press releases and hiring attorneys. A special grand jury was rumored, though nobody could confirm it. At the same time, survivors of other tragedies began contacting the investigators, families with missing loved ones, towns with their own buried scandals, asking if the same shadows might stretch into their histories. The crescendo came during a live town hall broadcast nationally. Families of the missing sisters sat in the front row, clutching in large photographs of the women in their habits. Behind them, the auditorium was packed with townspeople, half applauding the investigators, half shouting them down. The moderator asked a simple question: "What do you believe happened to the sisters?" The lead investigator, tired from weeks of fighting, but unwilling to soften the truth, answered plainly, "They were taken, compelled, and buried in silence by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them." What we found beneath that ride is not just an artifact, it's evidence of obedience turned into violence. The hall erupted. Some stood in applause, others stormed out. Cameras captured every angle, and by morning the clip had gone viral, sparking think pieces about the dangers of unchecked authority, the complicity of faith, and the fragility of small-town innocence. Hillsdale was no longer in control of its story. It had become a symbol, a cautionary tale dissected by millions. Yet amid the noise, a quieter consequence unfolded. A memorial began to take shape at the gates of the abandoned fairgrounds. People came at night, leaving flowers, rosaries, photographs, handwritten notes. The mound of offerings grew until it became impossible to ignore. Even those who refused to believe the worst found themselves moved by the sight of names written in candlelight, For the first time in 36 years, the sisters were remembered not as rumors but as human, beings whose lives had been cut short. The investigators stood at the edge of that memorial one evening, watching strangers bow their heads in silence. The case had exploded into the public sphere, beyond their control, beyond even Hillsdale's control, and yet standing there, they felt the weight of unfinished business pressing harder than ever. The truth had been exposed, yes, but exposure was not justice, and justice still felt out of reach. Autumn came early that year, as if the air itself wanted to turn the page. The fairgrounds, once littered with police tape and television vans, now stood mostly empty. Grass had begun to reclaim the excavation pit, wind scattering fallen leaves across the rusting frame of the Tilt-A-Whirl. The investigators walked slowly along the perimeter fence, taking in the silence. After months of unearthing noise, press conferences, hearings, demonstrations, the stillness felt almost unnatural, as though the land itself were waiting to exhale. The memorial remained. Candles flickered in rows at the entrance gate, wax pooling into hardened rivulets on the cracked pavement. Flowers, long wilted, had been replaced again and again by fresh bouquets. Wooden crosses stood where strangers had driven them into the ground, each one marked with a sister's name. Handmade rosaries dangled from the fence links, clinking softly when the wind blew. In the center, laminated photographs of the 7 women stared back with quiet dignity, reminders that beneath every theory, every revelation were lives lived and lost. Families came still, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. Some prayed aloud. Others simply touched the photographs and wept in silence. In town, the effects of the revelations rippled outward. The county board had been reshuffled, 2 members resigning under pressure, others facing potential charges. The convent, once a fortress of silence, announced it would open part of its archives to state investigators. Some hailed it as progress. Others condemned it as betrayal. Hillsdale itself seemed split down the middle. Murals appeared on brick walls, one depicting the sisters in halos of light, another vandalized with accusations of lies that the community had become a mirror of the story itself, fractured, haunted, but unable to ignore the shadows any longer. For the investigators, closure was complicated. They had uncovered evidence, forced accountability, and restored the sisters' story to the public memory. Yet no trial had been set, no definitive charges filed against those who orchestrated the events of 1988. The truth was undeniable, but justice remained elusive. "Exposure is not resolution," one of them murmured, standing before the memorial as the sun dipped behind the horizon. And yet, in the murmurs of prayer around them, and the candles glowing against the dark, they felt that some measure of peace had been reclaimed. The final gathering took place at the town's chapel. It wasn't an official ceremony, nor was it announced. Word had simply spread, and by evening the pews were full. The families of the sisters sat in the front row holding hands. The investigators sat in the back, preferring to watch quietly as hymns were sung and names read aloud one by one. No one spoke of conspiracy or cover-up. No one mentioned the fair or the convent. The night was dedicated to memory, to acknowledging lives stolen, and the community that had been shaped in their absence. Tears fell, voices cracked, and for a moment, the divisions that had torn the town apart seemed to dissolve. Afterward, as people filed out, one of the elderly relatives pressed a folded paper into the lead investigator's hand. "She wanted this saved," the woman whispered. Later, beneath the glow of a street lamp, the investigator unfolded it. It was a page torn from a notebook, the edges browned with age. Scrawled in hurried handwriting were 3 words. "Look at Millstone." Beneath it, a date August 1989. The note was small, cryptic, almost an afterthought. Yet it was enough to tighten the chest, enough to remind them that stories like this rarely ended cleanly. Millstone was a nearby town, a name already familiar from whispers that had surfaced in the hearings. The suggestion was clear. Hillsdale's tragedy might only be one chapter in a larger ledger of silence and control. The investigator folded the page again and tucked it into their coat pocket. Around them the night was quiet, the chapel bells tolling softly as families drifted home. The fairgrounds, the convent, the hearings, all of it had reached its conclusion, at least for now. but the paper in their pocket was a thread, fragile but undeniable, tugging them toward another shadow, another story waiting beneath the surface. The camera of memory would linger here, candles flickering, names whispered, the town scarred but awake. And then, just as the screen faded to black, one word would remain like an echo across the silence: millstone.